Welcome back to the Lord Lucan case on YouTube. Lucan case has fascinated people from all over the world now for almost half a century. Indeed, there have been alleged sightings of Lord Lucan all over the world. In this episode in the series, I'm going to read to you the contents of 3 letters that Lord Lucan wrote in the early hours of Friday the 8th of November 1974. So this was the early hours, the day after the dreadful events that had taken place at his former family home at 46 Belgrave Street. 2 of the letters were written to Lucan's brother-in-law, Bill Shand Kydd, and the 3rd letter was written to Michael Stoop, who was a very good friend of Lord Lucan's, and indeed Michael had loaned his car, which was a dark blue Ford Corsair car, registration Kilo Yankee November 135D for Delta. He had loaned the car to Lord Lucan because at that time Lucan's Mercedes had an intermittent battery problem. So Michael very kindly loaned the car to Lord Lucan. And they were both gamblers, of course, at the Clermont Club, so their association through that was well documented. So, as I said, in this episode, I want to concentrate on the 3 letters that Lord Lucan wrote. I think it's very important for viewers to have an interpretation, or at least understand my interpretation of those letters and why I believe that there was no intention for him to commit suicide, as the stories and the rumours were circulated later on that because of where the location of the Ford Corsair car was found in Newhaven, which was a commercial ferry port with regular sailings between Newhaven and Dieppe in France. The car was found there, but I think it was a total ridiculous suggestion for anybody to really believe that he drove to Newhaven, parked the car, boarded a ferry, jumped off, and made sure he got into the propellers so that his body would never be discovered. Anyway, let's have a look at the 3 letters because I want to read them verbatim to you, word for word. I will have to refer to my book where they have been reproduced. So this is the first of the 2 letters that Lucan wrote to Bill Shand Kydd, his brother-in-law. Dear Bill, the most ghastly of circumstances arose tonight, which I briefly described to my mother. When I interrupted the fight at Lower Belgrave Street, and the man left Veronica, accused me of having hired him. I took her upstairs and sent Frances up to bed and tried to clean Veronica up. She lay dogo for a bit when I was in the bathroom. Then Veronica left the house. The circumstantial evidence against me is strong in that V will say it was all my doing. I will also lay dogo for a bit, but I'm only concerned for the children. If you can manage it, I want them to live with you. Coots, trustees, St. Martin's Lane, Mr. Wall, will handle school fees. V has demonstrated her hatred for me in the past and would do anything to see me accused. For George and Francis to go through life knowing their father had stood in the dock for attempted murder would be too much. When they are old enough to understand, explain to them the dream of paranoia and look after them. Yours ever, John. So if we just look at that first letter, it was very, very clear that he refers to the events at 46 Lower Belgrave Street as being attempted murder. And I've always remained convinced that it was when he had entered the house and the man ran out that Lord Lucan tried to silence Veronica, not kill her, just silence her because she was hysterical. And he didn't want that to be viewed as an attempted murder of his wife. But he knew, or he certainly believed, that based upon his recent experiences in the court over the custody of his 3 children, where he had lost, he had no faith in the judicial system that it wouldn't interpret it as murder. So he was very clear it was attempted. He didn't want it to be murder. He was purely attempting to keep her quiet because she was hysterical. It's interesting in that letter, actually, that the middle child, Camilla, is not mentioned at all. It's only Francis and George, so the eldest and the youngest, and George being his son and heir. If we go on to the second letter now that Lucan wrote to Bill Shand Kydd, that largely was to do with financial matters and an upcoming sale. So it was headed Financial Matters. He says there is a sale coming up at Christie's on November the 27th, which will satisfy bank overdrafts. Please agree reserves with Tom Craig. Proceeds to go to Lloyd, 6 Pall Mall, Coots, 59 Strand, NatWest, Bloomsbury branch, and also equitable and law life policy. The other creditors can get lost for the time being. And he signs it Lucky. Again, he's talking about for the time being, as though he's going to sort it all out. He thinks he's going to deal with all these matters. Interesting. So it's very much not, in my view, a suicide letter. Not a suicide letter. If we go on to the third letter now, so as I say, this is a letter that he wrote to Michael Stoop, his fellow gambler of the Clermont Club, and as I say, who had loaned him the Ford Corsair car. He wrote, "Dear Michael, I have had a traumatic night of unbelievable coincidences. However, I won't bore you with anything or involve you, except to say that when you come across my children, which I hope you will, please tell them you knew me and that all I cared about was them. The fact that a crooked solicitor and a rotten psychiatrist destroyed me between them will be of no importance to the children. I gave Bill Shand Kydd an account of what actually happened, but judging by my last effort in court number 1, let alone a 67-year-old judge would believe, and I no longer care, except that my children should be protected. Yours ever, John." those are the three letters, and I think it's interesting that they were written so soon after the murder of Mrs Sandra Rivett and the attempted silencing of Lady Lucan. You have to bear in mind, I think, as well here, that two of the letters, the first two to Bill Shand Kydd, were allegedly written at Grant Hill House, which was the home in Uckfield of Ian and Susan Maxwell Scott. So if you know anything about this case, it's always been widely publicised that Susan Maxwell Scott, who was a trained, qualified barrister, but was never, she was called to the bar, but she never ever practiced law. It was to her home that apparently Lord Lucan drove to after leaving London. And it is at her home that Lucan allegedly wrote these two letters to his brother-in-law, Bill Shand Kydd. Those two letters were then posted by one of Susan's daughters by the name of Catherine as she walked to school the following morning. So that was Friday the 8th of November, the morning after the murder. It is well known and documented again that Lucan had apparently said to Susan Maxwell Scott that he had to leave and, quote, clear things up. He had to get back. And apparently he left Susan's house at about 1:15 in the morning, saying exactly that. And Susan had assumed that John, as she referred to him, was returning to London to clear things up, get back to London. Susan was absolutely convinced, and she knew him very, very well, if not intimately. And being a legal person and a very sensible person, she could weigh individuals up very well. And it's always been her opinion, in her view, that he would never have taken his own life. So you then also have to consider that if Lucan did actually go to Susan Maxwell Scott's house, and I don't think he ever did, Uckfield is 16 miles, which is about 27 minutes drive away from Newhaven. So you're heading southwest, basically, to Newhaven. Whereas London is more north of Uckfield, and it's some 46 miles. So imagine the scenario where, if you believe everything that's been written, that Susan's assessed John, her close friend. She doesn't think that he's suicidal. He's turned round and told her that he's got to get back to clear things up. Get back only means London, doesn't mean anywhere else. It can't mean anywhere else. He's got to get back, sort the mess out. Was he actually conning Susan? Was he capable of conning Susan? Did he have in his mind, while he was saying that he was going to drive in the completely opposite direction? He was going to go down to Newhaven, dump his car, get on a ferry, and go and jump overboard from the ferry, make sure that he jumps into the propellers so his body's all dismembered and he's never found again. is it logical to believe that as he drove out of her driveway, as Susan says, at 1:15 in the morning or thereabouts, that he suddenly had a change of mind? No, I don't believe he would have. Not at all. Not at all. So, the other interesting thing to say about this is that the car, and I spoke to Detective Chief Inspector David Gehring, otherwise known as Buster Gehring. I spoke to him many times about this during our frequent meetings at the Dolphin Pub in Bovey Tracy. He had retired from the police service, and he was living part of his retirement down in Devon. It was David mentioned to me that it should never be forgotten that when the car was found by a local policeman, which was actually found 3 days after the murder, so it was discovered at 2:40 p.m. on Sunday, the 10th of November. It was discovered outside number 35, Norman Road, Newhaven. The very interesting thing is that that was on the opposite side of the port from where the ferry sailed to Dieppe. It makes it more of an interesting situation then to understand that the whole car planting was a total decoy. I don't believe Lucan dumped the car outside 35 Norman Road. And I did have the opportunity some years ago to actually go down and speak to the owner of the house. Very nice gentleman indeed. But if only he had, as I've said in my previous videos, like a lot of us, we get up in the middle of the night, we need to have a pee in the bathroom. And some of us might look out the window and, see if it's raining or it might be snowing or see what's going on, that sort of thing. The gentleman was in the habit of looking out of his window most nights when he got up to go to the bathroom. Unfortunately, on this particular night, he went to the bathroom and returning to bed, he never looked out of the window. Had he looked out of the window at the right time, and it is believed that the car had been parked there probably between about 3 and 5 a.m., then the whole story would be much different. My belief, as I say, that Lucan never went to Susan Maxwell Scott's house. He knew that Ian wasn't there. Ian was in London at the Clermont Club. So why would he want to drive all the way down to Newhaven? Just to get legal advice off Susan Maxwell Scott? Was that what he wanted people to believe? Just to get legal advice? No. If you accept what Susan Maxwell Scott says, that he arrived and he had a bit of a damp patch on his trouser, but didn't see any blood, and he told her what happened and gave him a coffee and gave him a couple of whiskies, and then he just sort of said a few hours later, "Oh, I got to leave now." She offered him a bed for the night. He turned the offer of a bed down and said, "No, I have to get back to sort things out, to clear things up." When Susan was interviewed eventually by police, she was asked, "Well, why didn't you report the fact that Lucan had been to your home and spent a few hours with you and had coffee and whiskey and, got you up in the middle of the night and you waved him off down the driveway at 1:15 in the morning?" You know, this is a serious case here. This is a murder. And she said that they never saw anything on television, or they didn't watch television, or something like that, she said. And we didn't have any newspapers delivered. Well, not having newspapers delivered rang a lot of alarm bells in my head. Her husband, Ian, was a tremendous gambler, just like Lucan. And Ian had actually had a big win, which had enabled him to buy the mansion, which was called Grants Hill House. He was very much into his racing. And at that time, in 1974, the Sporting Life had become a daily newspaper. We didn't have any mobile phones and internet and anything like that. So it was all down to newspapers. If you wanted to know the form, you had to have the newspaper or have a whisper from someone, a good tip-off. Gamblers were always buying the newspapers. The Sporting Life, a very famous newspaper. And I actually tracked down the newsagent, the couple who owned the newsagents in the Highfield, in Uckfield, and they gave me a very different story to what Susan said. I never asked David about it, David Gehring, the police officer, whether he had spoken to them. Mainly during my meetings with David, we were more concerned about Lucan living in Africa and and all that sort of thing, and trying to track him down. But if I had been the police officer and Susan had told me that they had never read any newspapers or they didn't have them delivered and that sort of thing, I would have been checking it out to see whether they had newspapers delivered, and would have thought it highly unusual because for no other reason than the fact of the Sporting Life. And even if they didn't have newspapers delivered, that meant that Ian would have had to walk down the high street and gone into the newsagent to buy his Sporting Life. And he would have seen the front of all the other tabloids. So there was no getting away from it. All this was designed to do was to buy him more time, to buy Lucan more time, and for the plan to be put together. And that plan worked very well indeed. They couldn't get everything right because they were under great pressure. Nobody expected this to happen. Nobody expected it. Not even Lucan. So a plan was formulated, and over the years, it's by and large, it's worked pretty well. Pretty well. Because the 7th of November this year, 2024, it'll be 50 years that the Lucan mystery has remained unsolved. Watch out for the next episode, which is coming up soon. One point, in case I didn't mention it, Leyendogo. It's like an English expression. I'm going to lay low for a while. I'm going to keep a low profile. Right, Leyendogo. That is what Lucan put in his letters. Clear intention there to do that very thing. Lay low. If he lays low, that's not suicide. He had every intention of coming back, but he wasn't able to. And he wasn't able to because of the damning statements that were given by Veronica. So just as Lucan said, he suspected, he knew that V absolutely hated him and would do anything. So she gave a damning statement against him to the police, as did Greville Howard. And Greville Howard was another associate of Lucan's who used to frequent the Clermont Club in Berkeley Square, London, now Lord Howard. And you have to remember an interesting point. As I said in a previous video, Greville Howard was actually the tenant of the Mews house of 46 Lower Belgrave Street. So in other words, at the back of the house, you have the Mews, and the Lucans owned the Mews flat at the back. So the tenant at that time, on the night of the murder, was Greville Howard. Yet he gave a damning statement against Lord Lucan. And he basically said that Lord Lucan had informed him that, you know, he was going to murder his wife, and, you know, that's along those lines. So it was very, very damaging to Lord Lucan. And it was the combination of those two statements that made it absolutely impossible for him to return. Impossible. And as Lord Lucan had already said in his letters, that he had no faith in the courts because of his recent experience in the No. 1 court in front of a 67-year-old judge. So he had no faith in it. So he was going to have even less faith if he returned with the two statements already submitted to the police against him from Greville Howard, who was supposed to be his friend. He was supposed to dine with him at the Clermont Club on the night of the murder. And the second statement, as I say, that had been given against him by Veronica. Anyway, I think that's all for now. If you'd like to help support my further work on this case, as I've travelled mainly in Africa about this case, then please consider subscribing, turn on notifications so you get the latest alerts when the next episode goes up. Welcome all comments, and hope you join us again soon. Thank you for watching.